Bouncer threw out the grizzled veteran from the military ball until the Admiral saw his Medal of Honor. The rain hammered against the windows of the Grand Marriott Hotel in downtown Chicago as military personnel in crisp dress uniforms streamed through the gleaming lobby. Tonight was the annual Illinois Veterans Ball, a prestigious event where decorated officers, politicians, and military elite gathered to honor service and sacrifice. The marble floors reflected the shimmer of medals and ribbons adorning pristine uniforms, while the soft hum of conversations filled the air with talk of campaigns, commendations, and career achievements. Outside, hunched against the October wind, stood Frank Morrison. His weathered face bore the deep lines of 72 years, with silver stubble covering hollow cheeks. His clothes told a different story than those inside. A faded green army jacket that had seen better decades, worn jeans with patches at the knees, and scuffed boots that had walked countless miles. In his gnarled hands, he clutched a crumpled invitation that had arrived at his modest apartment 3 weeks ago. Frank approached the hotel entrance with hesitant steps. Through the glass doors, he could see the opulence that awaited crystal chandeliers, servers carrying silver trays, and the cream of military society mingling beneath banners honoring fallen heroes. His reflection in the glass showed a man who looked more like he belonged in a soup kitchen than a five-star hotel ballroom. Before continuing, give this story a like and subscribe to discover more tales of hidden heroes whose true valor often goes unrecognized by those who judge only what they see. The uniformed doorman's expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed distaste as Frank stepped through the entrance. Water dripped from his jacket onto the pristine marble as he shuffled toward the registration table, his boots squeaking with each step. The conversations around him seemed to pause, replaced by whispered exchanges and sideways glances. "Excuse me, sir," called Marcus Thompson, the imposing head of security for the event. At 6'4", with the build of a former linebacker, Marcus cut an intimidating figure in his black suit. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Frank's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket, producing both his invitation and a worn driver's license. Marcus examined them with skeptical eyes, clearly suspicious of how someone like Frank could have received an invitation to such an exclusive gathering. "This doesn't look right," Marcus muttered, noting the contrast between the elegant invitation and the man holding it. "Sir, I think there's been some mistake. This event is for military personnel and their guests only." "I served," Frank said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient chatter. 27 years, Army Special Forces." Marcus looked him up and down, taking in the threadbare clothing and unkempt appearance. "Sir, with all due respect, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private event, and we can't have—" He paused, searching for diplomatic words, "disruptions." The registration area had grown quiet as other attendees began to notice the commotion. Young officers in their dress blues watched with curious expressions, while their companions whispered behind gloved hands. Frank felt the familiar weight of judgment, the same look he'd received countless times when trying to find work, housing, or simply respect in a world that had moved on without him. "Please," Frank said, his voice carrying a dignity that his appearance couldn't convey. "I was invited. I served my country." But Marcus had already made his decision. "Security," he called to 2 additional guards. "Please escort this gentleman outside." As the guards approached, Frank clutched his invitation tighter, the paper crinkling in his weathered grip. 47 years after returning from the jungles of Southeast Asia, he was being ejected from an event meant to honor people exactly like him. The irony wasn't lost on him, even as shame burned in his chest. The watching crowd of military elite remained silent, their polished medals catching the light as Frank was quietly but firmly guided toward the exit, his moment of recognition slipping away like smoke in the Chicago wind. The security guards flanked Frank as they moved through the lobby, their polished shoes clicking against marble while his worn boots shuffled between them. He didn't resist resistance, had been beaten out of him years ago by a system that had forgotten men like him. The eyes of distinguished guests followed their progression, some curious, others relieved that the uncomfortable presence was being removed. Colonel Patricia Hayes, resplendent in her dress uniform adorned with numerous ribbons, leaned toward her companion. Honestly, how do these people even get invitations? Security should be better at screening. Her comment carried just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, eliciting nods of agreement from those who valued appearances above all else. To them, Frank represented everything they'd rather forget about military service. The casualties that couldn't be measured in blood, the invisible wounds that left good soldiers looking like broken men. As they neared the entrance, Frank's steps slowed. Through the glass, he could see his reflection again, a specter of the proud soldier he'd once been. His mind drifted to 1971, when he'd worn his own dress uniform with pride, standing straight and tall, chest decorated with ribbons that meant something to him then. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, commendations that had been earned in the hell of combat. "Just a few more steps, sir," one of the guards said, not unkindly. Marcus Thompson followed behind, his expression resolute but not cruel. He genuinely believed he was protecting the integrity of the event, maintaining the standards that such occasions demanded. Frank stopped walking. "You know," he said softly, turning to face Marcus, "I understand why you're doing this. I know how I look." Marcus paused, something in Frank's voice catching his attention. There was an unexpected eloquence, a dignity that didn't match the shabby exterior. "I came home from Vietnam in 1971, Frank continued, his voice growing stronger. "3 tour Special Forces. I was 25 years old, and I thought I was invincible." He looked down at his weathered hands. "Took me 40 years to realize that some wounds don't show on the outside. Sir, I appreciate your service, but do you know what it's like to wake up every night for 50 years? Frank interrupted, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "To hear helicopters that aren't there. To jump every time a car backfires because it sounds like incoming mortar." The lobby had grown quieter. Some guests pretended not to listen, but Frank's words carried an authenticity that was impossible to ignore. "I lost my family because I couldn't sleep without nightmares, lost my job because I couldn't concentrate, lost my house because I couldn't keep work." Frank's voice remained steady, factual rather than self-pitying. "But I never lost my honor, that's still in here." He tapped his chest with one finger. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I understand, but this is still a private event, and I'm still not dressed appropriately," Frank finished. "I get it, son, I really do." As they reached the entrance, Frank turned for one last look at the ballroom beyond. Through the archway, he could see tables set with fine china, centerpieces of red, white, and blue flowers, and banners honoring military service. It was everything he'd once been part of, a world that had moved on without him. "The invitation came to my apartment," he said quietly. "First mail I'd gotten in months that wasn't a bill or a notice. I thought maybe someone remembered." He pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket and handed it to Marcus. "Keep it. Maybe it was meant for someone else anyway." But as Frank stepped toward the door, a voice cut through the lobby's ambience, a voice carrying the unmistakable authority of decades in command. "Hold on there, soldier." The voice belonged to Admiral Robert Sterling, whose presence commanded immediate attention throughout the lobby. At 78, he moved with the measured stride of a career naval officer, his dress uniform immaculate, his bearing still rigid despite his age. The crowd parted naturally as he approached, medals gleaming on his chest like a constellation of service and sacrifice. Marcus straightened instinctively, recognizing the Admiral's rank and reputation. Admiral Sterling had served in Vietnam, the Gulf War, and held positions at the Pentagon before retiring with full honors 15 years prior. Tonight, he was the guest of honor, the man whose distinguished career they'd gathered to celebrate. "Admiral Sterling, sir," Marcus began, "I heard what you were doing, son," Sterling interrupted, his steel-gray eyes fixed not on Marcus, but on Frank. And I want to get a good look at this man you're escorting out. Frank stood motionless as the Admiral approached, decades of military training causing him to automatically straighten his shoulders despite his shabby appearance. Something flickered in Sterling's eyes as he studied Frank's weathered face, searching through layers of time and hardship. "What's your name, soldier?" Sterling asked, his voice carrying both authority and curiosity. "Frank Morrison, sir. Staff Sergeant, retired, 5th Special Forces Group." Sterling's expression shifted, a recognition dawning that made him take a step closer. "Morrison, Frank Morrison from Tennessee." "Yes, sir." The Admiral's face transformed as memories cascaded through his mind. November 1971, Firebase Alpha, about 30 clicks west of Da Nang. Frank's eyes widened. "You remember." The lobby had fallen completely silent now. Every guest, every server, every security guard stood transfixed as they witnessed something none of them had expected. Sterling's voice carried across the marble expanse with crystal clarity. "Son, this man saved my life 40 years ago in Vietnam." Marcus's hand dropped from Frank's arm as if he'd been electrified. The other security guards stepped back, their entire understanding of the situation crashing down around them. "I was a young lieutenant then," Sterling continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Cocky, inexperienced, leading a patrol into territory I had no business entering. We walked straight into an ambush North Vietnamese regulars who'd been waiting for us." Frank remained silent, but his eyes never left the Admiral's face. "3 of my men went down in the first 30 seconds, Sterling said, addressing not just Frank but the entire lobby. "I took shrapnel in my leg, couldn't move, couldn't think. The enemy was closing in, and I was certain I was going to die in that jungle." Colonel Hayes, who had made the dismissive comment earlier, looked pale as she realized what was unfolding. "This man," Sterling said, placing his hand on Frank's shoulder, "crawled through enemy fire to reach my position. Carried me and 2 other wounded soldiers nearly half a mile through jungle to the extraction point. Single-handedly held off enemy forces while we waited for the chopper." Frank's voice was barely a whisper. "Just doing my job, sir." "Your job?" Sterling's voice rose with incredulous respect. "Son, you saved 4 lives that day, including mine, and you did it at the cost of—" He paused, studying Frank's face again. "You took a round in the head, didn't you?" Frank nodded slowly, grazed my temple. "Scrambled things up pretty good." The Admiral turned to address the stunned crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man received the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. The Medal of Honor. And we just tried to throw him out in the rain." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Frank quietly weeping, not from shame, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen, finally being remembered for who he truly was beneath the worn exterior. The revelation hit the gathered crowd like a thunderclap. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. In the entire lobby filled with decorated officers and military personnel, not one of them wore that particular ribbon. It was rarer than precious metals, earned through actions that defied comprehension. Marcus Thompson felt his face burn with shame as the full weight of his mistake became clear. He'd ejected a Medal of Honor recipient, a living legend, because of his appearance. Around him, the distinguished guests shifted uncomfortably, their own prejudices laid bare in Sterling's words. "Frank," Admiral Sterling said gently, "do you still have it?" "The medal." Frank's weathered hand moved to his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, battered velvet box. His fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing the distinctive star-shaped medal suspended from its light blue ribbon. Despite everything Frank had lost over the decades, his home, his family, his stability, he'd kept this one reminder of the man he'd once been. Sterling examined the medal with reverence, then held it up for all to see. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is what real heroism looks like. Not in the shine of our uniforms or the elegance of our gathering, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything for others." Colonel Hayes stepped forward, her earlier dismissive attitude replaced by visible remorse. "Mr. Morrison, I owe you an apology. We all do." Frank shook his head. "Ma'am, you couldn't have known. I don't look like much these days." "But that's exactly the point," Sterling interjected. "We've become so focused on appearances, on the politics and pageantry of military service, that we've forgotten what it actually means." He gestured toward Frank's worn clothing. "This man has been fighting a different kind of war for 50 years, against nightmares, against a system that failed him, against a society that forgot him." The Admiral's voice grew stronger, addressing the entire assembly. "How many of us have walked past men like Frank on the street? How many times have we looked at a homeless veteran and seen failure instead of sacrifice?" Dr. Margaret Chen, the event organizer, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Morrison, please accept our sincere apologies. This evening was meant to honor heroes, and instead we dishonored the greatest hero among us." Frank looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that had transformed from judgment to respect, from dismissal to reverence. For the first time in decades, he stood straight, his shoulders square, remembering what it felt like to wear the uniform with pride. "I didn't come here for recognition," Frank said, his voice steady. "I came because I thought maybe, for one night, I could remember what it felt like to belong somewhere again." Sterling clasped Frank's shoulder firmly. "Son, you belong everywhere. You earned that right in a jungle 40 years ago, and nothing, not poverty, not illness, not the failures of the system, can take that away from you." Marcus Thompson stepped forward, his face etched with genuine remorse. "Mr. Morrison, sir, I owe you the deepest apology. I judged you by your appearance instead of your character. That was wrong, and I'm ashamed." Frank studied the young security chief for a moment, then extended his hand. "We all make mistakes, son. The measure of a man isn't in avoiding them, but in how he handles them afterward." As they shook hands, Dr. Chen made an announcement that would change everything. "Mr. Morrison, as the organizer of this event, I'm formally inviting you to be our keynote speaker. Your story, your real story, is exactly what we need to hear." The crowd erupted in applause, but Frank raised his hand for silence. "I appreciate the gesture, ma'am, but I'm not dressed for speaking to folks like you." Admiral Sterling smiled. "Frank, after what you've been through, after what you've survived, do you really think anyone here cares about your clothes?" 20 minutes later, Frank Morrison stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Marriott, looking out at 400 of the most distinguished military personnel in Illinois. The same people who had watched his near ejection now sat in complete silence, hanging on every word he spoke. He declined their offer of a borrowed dress uniform. Instead, he stood before them exactly as he was, weathered army jacket, faded jeans, and all. The contrast was stark against the elegant backdrop, but it served his purpose perfectly. 47 years ago, Frank began, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustically perfect room, I came home from Vietnam believing I was a hero. I had a chest full of medals, commendations from officers, and the gratitude of a nation. I thought the hardest part was over. The audience leaned forward, captivated by his authenticity. I was wrong. The real war started when I got home, not against an enemy I could see and fight, but against memories that followed me everywhere. Against a society that thanked me for my service, but didn't want to deal with the consequences of that service. Frank's eyes found Marcus Thompson in the crowd. A good man nearly threw me out tonight because I don't look like your idea of a hero. And you know what? He was right to question it. I don't look like a hero anymore. He paused, letting that sink in. But here's what I've learned in 50 years of carrying this burden. Heroism isn't a moment in time. It's not something you achieve and then keep forever like a trophy on your shelf. Heroism is getting up every morning when you'd rather stay in bed. It's facing another day when the nightmares make sleep impossible. It's choosing to keep living when dying would be easier. The room was so quiet that the sound of the rain against the windows became audible. Every homeless veteran you pass on the street is still fighting their war. Every soldier struggling with addiction, with depression, With the invisible wounds of combat, they're all heroes, even if they don't look like it anymore. Admiral Sterling nodded from the front row, his own eyes moist with recognition of truths long avoided. I didn't come here tonight seeking recognition, Frank continued. I came because I was lonely, because for one evening I wanted to remember what it felt like to be part of something bigger than my own struggles. He looked around the room at faces that had completely changed their perception of him. But what I found was something more important. I found that heroism doesn't end when the uniforms come off. It continues in how we treat each other, in how we recognize worth that isn't always visible, in how we honor service that doesn't always shine. Frank's voice grew stronger as he reached his conclusion. The real Medal of Honor isn't made of metal. It's made of compassion, of recognition, of refusing to judge a person's worth by their appearance. Tonight, you all have the chance to earn that medal. The standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes. But more importantly, it marked the beginning of something larger. Dr. Chen announced the establishment of the Frank Morrison Foundation for Homeless Veterans. Marcus Thompson quit his security job the next day to become a counselor for Veterans Services. Colonel Hayes redirected her career toward veteran rehabilitation programs. And Frank moved into a small apartment provided by the foundation, began receiving the mental health care he'd needed for decades, and started speaking at military events across the country. Not as a relic of past glory, but as a living reminder that heroism takes many forms, and sometimes the greatest battles are fought long after the war is over. 6 months later, Frank stood in the same hotel lobby, this time as an honored guest, arriving early for another event. The same doorman who had looked at him with distaste now greeted him warmly by name. The transformation wasn't in Frank's appearance. He still looked like what he was, a weathered veteran carrying decades of hard living. The transformation was in how people chose to see him. As he walked through the lobby toward the ballroom, Frank caught his reflection in the glass again.